January 17, 1942, the icy breath of the North Atlantic off the eastern seaboard of the United States. It is a night of perfect velvet blackness, broken only by the sporadic oil-stained glitter of the churning water. Below the surface, in the steel-ribbed, pressure-hugging silence of U-123, Captain Reinhard Hartigan listens. The air is thick with the metallic tang of diesel, sweat, and anticipation. Every man is poised, their world shrunk to the confines of this deep-diving predator. For the German Kriegsmarine, this is Operation Drumbeat, the dawn of their assault on the unguarded American coastline. Hartigan hears it, the rhythmic, unsuspecting thrum of an American tanker, Coimbra. The ship, fully illuminated against the dark coastal silhouette, a naive beacon of peacetime carelessness, is a target of exquisite ease. Hartigan's men expected resistance, maybe a few antiquated destroyers. They expected a war, but not a slaughter. They expected the Americans to be slow, fat, and utterly unprepared. This, they realized in a silent, collective breath, was the happy time. The American war machine, the colossal, slumbering giant of industry, was still deeply asleep, and the U-boat Wolf was ravenous at the throat of the continent. The torpedo rips through the water, a ghost streak. Impact, a shattering, apocalyptic concussion that vibrates through the ocean, followed by the gruesome, satisfying sound of bulkheads collapsing and steam escaping. The Coimbra vanishes into the oil-slicked abyss, a casualty counted instantly, silently, in Berlin. The German crew smile, their faces illuminated by the dim red glow of the gauges. They had come to starve an island, and now they would starve a continent. They felt invincible. They believed profoundly that their speed and stealth would ensure victory before American democracy could even lift its head from the pillow. They were certain that for every vessel they consigned to the deep, it would take the slow, bureaucratic peacetime shipyard months to replace. They had math on their side, they had statistics, but they failed to account for a factor entirely unique to the American spirit, the limitless, terrifying power of abundance forged into a weapon. The historical context is inescapable. By late 1941, Britain was a fortress island, and the only path to victory was supply. The U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic, not just winning, but dominating. They didn't need to defeat the Allied navies. They only needed to strangle the logistics. Prime Minister Churchill described it with brutal clarity. The U-boat war was the only thing that truly frightened him. The Allies were losing 50, 60, sometimes 100 ships a month. Merchant vessels, the fragile, irreplaceable arteries of war, were sinking far faster than the combined yards of the Commonwealth and the United States could launch replacements. The gap was a chasm measured in tonnage, in oil, in wheat, in lives. In the first 6 months of America's entry into the war, the U-boats claimed nearly 2 million tons of shipping, often within sight of New Jersey beaches. The German crews, basking in their happy time, sent back triumphant reports. The American coast is virgin territory, ships sail brightly lit, often alone. The U-boat men, honed by years of training and the philosophy of total, merciless warfare, saw themselves as the ultimate efficiency machine. They hunted with cold, calculated precision, expecting the Allied response to be equally measured, ship for ship, sunk for built. They failed to grasp that the very ideology they sought to destroy, the ideology of mass production, of unrestricted free enterprise, of limitless capacity, was about to be turned against them. For the German sailor, a ship was a strategic, rare asset. Sinking one was a monumental victory. For the American, a ship was about to become a component, a unit, a replaceable part in a greater machine. The enemy they faced wasn't a navy, it was an economy. The answer to this existential crisis was born not in the Pentagon, but in the gritty, windswept, and immensely ambitious mind of a man named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by trade. He was an infrastructure mogul, a dam builder, a concrete evangelist. He saw shipbuilding not as a craft, but as a manufacturing problem, a logistics challenge waiting for an industrial solution. The design he championed was the EC2SC1, swiftly christened the Liberty Ship. It was ugly, utilitarian, slow, and crude. Its profile was chunky, its engine archaic, designed to be simple enough for any novice worker to understand and build. It was the antithesis of the sleek, expensive, custom-built German U-boat, but it possessed one singular, terrifying virtue: speed of construction. Kaiser's insight was revolutionary. He jettisoned centuries of shipbuilding tradition. Ships were no longer to be built piece by painstaking piece, keel to mast, on a slipway. They would be mass-produced. They would be prefabricated. Hull sections, deck plates, bulkheads, hundreds of tons of steel would be welded together miles away in workshops, then transported by massive gantry cranes to the slipway, where they would be assembled like giant, floating Lego blocks. It was the assembly line brought to the sea. The sheer, overwhelming scale of this effort began to unfold across the American landscape. From Portland, Oregon, to Richmond, California, to Mobile, Alabama, and Baltimore, Maryland, massive industrial complexes sprang up almost overnight, carved out of marshes and estuaries. These were not just shipyards, they were cities of steel. They operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The pace was relentless, driven by the knowledge that every minute of delay meant another torpedo striking another tanker in the Atlantic. The German expectation, rooted in their own more traditional, methodical, industrial process, was that a vessel of 10,000 tons required at least a year on the ways. The reality was a blur of noise and light. The industrial soundscape of America was undergoing a seismic shift. The traditional rhythmic hammering of rivets, a time-honored sound of industry, was being replaced by a new, more intense sound, the hiss and crackle of the welding arc. The welding arc. It became the recurring symbol of this new, terrifying American abundance. It represented the speed, the heat, and the fusion of a democracy committed to production. In the dark shipyards, thousands of these brilliant, blinding white-blue lights flashed simultaneously, tiny suns burning constantly against the night sky, stitching together the fabric of victory at impossible speeds. Every flash was a steel plate joined, a section completed, a U-boat victory nullified. The workers themselves were part of the transformation. They came from every walk of life: farm boys, housewives, retired mechanics, men who had never held a tool, women who had never worked outside the home. They were paid well, they ate well, and they worked in shifts that never stopped. The German soldier was driven by rigid ideology and fear of command. The American worker was driven by the knowledge that their brother, husband, or son was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic for the supplies only they could deliver. A contemporary account captured the fervor of the Richmond shipyard. The steel arrived by train, raw, cold. It was cut, pre-assembled, and within 3 days it was a section of a ship. It was an inferno of human and mechanical energy. You could feel the war, not in explosions, but in the relentless rhythmic crackle of the thousands of welding torches that never cooled. This was the contrast: German U-boat sailor, claustrophobic, silent, meticulous, driven by limited resources. Every torpedo was finite. Every successful hunt bought them time. American shipyard worker, open air, deafeningly loud, collaborative, driven by seemingly infinite resources. Every shift added a new hull, negating the U-boat's previous time advantage. The U-boat crews expected to see the Allied supply curve flatten, break, and collapse. They expected panic and paralysis. What they got, starting in late 1942 and reaching a crescendo in 1943, was the psychological shock of endless, relentless replacement. The industrial pace quickened, entering the realm of the unbelievable. Kaiser's yards, in a contest fueled by patriotism and hyper-efficient management, began to shatter all records. The standard time to build a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days to 100 days to 40 days. Then came the legendary feats. The Robert E. Peary was assembled and launched in 4 days and 15 hours, a time frame that was strategically leaked to the German command. It was a stunt, a psychological weapon, but it was real. A 2,500-ton cargo vessel from the laying of the keel to launch in less time than it took a U-boat to complete a short patrol. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander-in-chief of U-boats, the data became a nightmare. He had expected a linear attrition war. The reality was an exponential graph that defied every naval doctrine. Let us look at the numbers that defined the pivot of the war. 1942, the crisis year, Allied losses, 8.2 million tons, the worst year Liberty ships delivered, 250. The industrial response was just beginning to ramp up. Ratio, the Germans were still clearly winning the tonnage war. 1943, the turning point, Allied losses, dropped dramatically. Liberty ships delivered, over 1,200 ships. Ratio, the U.S. shipyards were now building, on average, 3 times the tonnage the U-boats were sinking. The tipping point had been crossed. This was the moment of transformation. The German High Command, reading the intelligence reports, could only conclude that the United States had cracked the fundamental calculus of naval warfare. They were no longer fighting a finite enemy. They were fighting a factory. A fictionalized yet plausible quote from a staff meeting in the U-boat headquarters in 1943 might capture the despondency. They replaced them not by the month but by the week. We sink 1 and 2 more are already steaming across the horizon. We are running out of crews and torpedoes long before they run out of steel. It is not a battle of men, it is a battle of furnaces and production schedules. For the crews of the U-boats, the emotional contrast deepened into psychological exhaustion. Early in the war, the targets were varied, the hunts challenging, and the victories tangible. Now the ocean seemed to swarm with the same ugly, high-sided ships. They recognized the profile instantly, the ubiquitous EC-2. They were like a plague of industrial locusts, slow but unstoppable. Imagine the perspective of an officer aboard a Type 7 U-boat in the mid-Atlantic in late 1943. They had successfully navigated the growing gauntlet of Allied air cover and radar-equipped destroyers, the increasingly lethal escort ships that were themselves delivered by the relentless Liberty ship pipeline. They found a convoy, a vast, seemingly endless collection of gray shapes. They launched their torpedoes, saw the flash, and heard the distant, muffled thump. Success. But where before a sinking was celebrated as a strategic victory, now it was met with a cold, hollow silence. The sinking of one Liberty ship was instantly, visibly replaced by 3 more steaming forward in the next column. The U-boat crew began to experience a profound sense of futility. Their stealth, their bravery, their technical superiority in submarine design, all were being systematically nullified by the sheer, crude, overwhelming volume of American production. The recurring symbol, the welding arc, began to invade their minds. They didn't hear it in the deep Atlantic, but they knew it was happening. Every survivor they questioned, every scrap of intercepted intelligence spoke of the 24-hour cycle of the yards. The U-boat was silent, dark, and finite. The shipyard was loud, blindingly bright, and infinite. The ark's crackle was the sound of a clock ticking toward Germany's defeat, a sound that never stopped, that never slept. The ship itself, the Liberty ship, was an embodiment of this ideology. It was built to last for 5 years, not 50. It was a disposable tool, a one-way ticket for war materiel. This concept of treating such a massive, ocean-going vessel as a consumable item was alien and horrifying to the German industrial mindset, which prized quality and longevity. The Americans had industrialized the concept of expendability, a luxury only a nation of true, unbridled abundance could afford. These ships, often manned by hastily trained crews of the merchant marine, many of whom were teenagers or old men brought out of retirement, sailed under the grim knowledge of the dangers. They were not naval vessels, they were floating warehouses. Yet they kept sailing. The ideology of democracy, the freedom of the individual worker to build a ship in 4 days, was being translated into the practical delivery of tanks and trucks on the beaches of North Africa and Italy. The industrial triumph of the Liberty Ship program was the single greatest factor in ensuring the success of the major Allied invasions. Without the 2,610 vessels eventually delivered by the program, the logistics of D-Day would have been impossible. The supplies carried by these unglamorous, flat-bottomed workhorses were the fuel for the ultimate fire of liberation. They delivered the hundreds of thousands of tons of steel for the invasion harbors, the mountains of ammunition, the millions of rations, the thousands of locomotives and trucks that would power the Allied advance across Europe. The transformation was complete. The war was no longer being won solely on the sea by naval combatants. It was being won in the smokestacks and the factory floors of the American interior. The U-boats were defeated not by a single, crushing naval engagement, but by a relentless industrial torrent that drowned them in sheer numbers. The hunter became the hunted, not because the U-boat had become less lethal, but because its targets had become superabundant. The law of averages, once a friend to the U-boats, became their executioner. By 1944, German U-boat losses were unsustainable. The industrial superiority of the enemy had created an environment where survival was a statistical anomaly. The emotional state of the U-boat crews shifted from triumphant predators to sacrificial lambs, knowing they faced an ocean that was not only teeming with Allied destroyers, but was also constantly spawning new, identical, unstoppable targets. They realized they were not fighting sailors, they were fighting the American worker, whose hand held a welding torch, not a rifle. The Liberty Ship program ended, leaving behind a legacy not of heroism, but of profound, almost frightening industrial capability. Most of the ships were quickly retired or sold off after the war, their temporary utilitarian purpose served. They were an ugly, short-lived class of vessel, overshadowed by the sleek, modern ships that followed. Yet, their true meaning endures. The Liberty Ship was a physical manifestation of an ideology. It demonstrated that a free, decentralized system, where workers were given agency and challenged to innovate, where a builder of dams could decide to reinvent the shipyard, could outproduce any centrally planned totalitarian system. The efficiency of American democracy was not in its politics, but in its ability to unleash unrestricted human and industrial energy. The ships were crude, but they were the vessels of plenty. They carried the raw, unpolished power of a free people to the shores of the world, a power built not with inherited tradition or rigid military decree, but with the sweat of thousands of ordinary men and women. The sound of the welding arc in the dead of night, blinding white against the dark water, was the sound of an economy at war, a sound the German submariners could never truly escape. It was the crackle of democracy outproducing tyranny, rivet by rivet, hull by hull. They never knew America's Liberty ships were built faster than their U-boats could sink them. They only knew that when they looked out across the vast rolling gray of the North Atlantic, they saw again and again the same ugly, defiant silhouette, a crude, mass-produced symbol of an abundance that was simply too big to sink. The Liberty Ship, built in 4 days, was the ultimate proof that freedom's forge burned hotter, faster, and longer than any furnace of war the Reich could ever conceive. The industrial capacity of a free nation was not just a resource, it was the decisive weapon.